Hi everyone, and welcome to Lake Oswego United Church of Christ. My name is Adam Erickson, and I wanted to talk with you a little bit about one of the passages we'll be discussing this Sunday, January 29th at 10:30 here at church. It's the Beatitudes. This is the Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12, and it's the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. And this is what many scholars claim is Jesus' fundamental teachings. But many criticize the Sermon on the Mount as Jesus saying, just be a doormat. When it comes to evil in the world, don't worry about it. Just sit back and let it happen. Now, how do people come to this conclusion? Well, because Jesus says things like, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, blessed are the meek. And so I think this is actually a misunderstanding that Jesus isn't saying, go just be a doormat. And one of the reasons is because people throughout history have looked to the Beatitudes and to the Sermon on the Mount as inspiration for fighting for justice. Just in the 20th century, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was inspired by the Sermon on the Mount to fight against Nazi Germany. Martin Luther King looked to it to fight for civil rights. Mahatma Gandhi read the Sermon on the Mount every day of his life to inspire him to work for justice when it came to the British Empire. So what is it about the Sermon on the Mount that has led so many people to work for justice in the world? Well, I think that we find one of our clues in the historical context. Jesus lived in Israel during one of the most horrific times of Israel's history, under the Roman Empire. The Romans conquered Israel, just like the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Persians had done before that. And if there was any kind of resistance at all in the Roman Empire, they would crucify people with the most horrific torture anybody had ever invented. And this is what Jesus is dealing with. And often when, as a nation or as individuals, bad things happen to us, we often think that maybe God is cursing us. Jesus is here saying, no. If you want to know where God's blessings are, look to those who are on the underside of history, those who are often marginalized. We often think that the powerful, those who run the world through violence, that's where you find God. But Jesus is saying, no, God blesses those who are vulnerable. That's where you will find God. God works within these people in order to try to make the world a better place. And that's, I think, what Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi and Dietrich Bonhoeffer are picking up from the Sermon on the Mount. God was with them as they were fighting against these big power structures within their society. But you also get a clue in the Beatitudes in verse 6. Verse 6 says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." Now, the word for righteousness here in Greek, the original language, is dikaios. And dikaios can be translated as righteousness, but it can also be translated as justice. Here we see that justice and righteousness are two sides of the same coin. Righteousness is often thought of being in right relationship with God. But that's not the whole story. Righteousness is also being in right relationship with our fellow human beings. And that's where justice comes in. Justice for Jesus and for the Hebrew prophets wasn't about what is just for me, what I deserve. It's what all of our fellow human beings deserve. Justice is working for the common good, but especially for the common good of those who are often marginalized, the poor, the meek, the vulnerable. This is where you find God working in the world. But you'll notice that Bonhoeffer and Gandhi and King pick up a non-violent aspect of this. You see, non-violence for them was not a passive thing. It was an active nonviolence, a search for justice, but it was also based on a love for enemies. So this is not a doormat ethic. It's an active search for justice in the world that is based on love for all people, including those we call our enemies. So one way that we can talk about this with our families is to talk about a time when you were going through difficulty and you may have thought that God had turned against you, but within it you see that God is working with you. And another good discussion could be about what are the ways in which we need to work for justice and righteousness in the world today? Where are things maybe not going towards the kingdom of God that Jesus preached, where all people are welcome and included in the spirit of love? You may be able to find some examples in our nation, in our schools, and in our world. And what can we do to work for justice in these places? So those are my thoughts on the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount. We start worship at 10:30 here at Lake Oswego United Church of Christ. Hope to see you then. Until then, grace and peace be with you.